When governance is working well, it often becomes invisible in a good way because decisions feel smoother, risks feel managed, and outcomes feel more predictable. But that invisibility can create a new problem. Stakeholders may not realize what governance is doing for them. In this episode, we're going to focus on communicating the value of governance of enterprise IT, GEIT, so stakeholders support governance choices consistently, especially when governance decisions are inconvenient, unpopular, or slower than someone wants in the moment. Communication is not a marketing project, and it is not a one-time announcement. It is a governance control that shapes whether people trust the rules, follow the processes, and accept trade-offs without constantly trying to bypass them. When stakeholders do not understand governance value, they interpret governance as bureaucracy, and then the enterprise loses consistency as different groups push for exceptions and special treatment. When stakeholders do understand governance value, they are more likely to accept decision criteria, respect decision rights, and collaborate across departments, which is exactly what governance needs to function. The goal here is to help you understand what governance value looks like to different stakeholders, how to communicate it in plain language, and how to build support that remains stable under time pressure. By the end, you should be able to explain why communication is part of governance itself and how good communication protects decision consistency. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful starting point is to define what we mean by governance value, because value in governance is not a single number and it is not limited to cost savings. Governance value is the set of benefits the enterprise gains when technology decisions are aligned to strategy, risk is managed deliberately, accountability is clear, and outcomes are measured and improved over time. Some of that value is visible, like fewer major incidents and clearer prioritization, and some is invisible until it is missing, like avoiding costly mistakes, avoiding regulatory surprises, and preventing duplication that slowly increases operating costs. Governance value also includes decision speed in a mature sense, because when decision rights and criteria are clear, the enterprise can make decisions faster than when every decision becomes a debate. Another form of value is trust, meaning stakeholders trust that decisions are fair, explainable, and consistent, which reduces political conflict and friction. Beginners sometimes think governance value is only about control, but governance also creates value by enabling better investment choices and by reducing rework caused by unclear standards and inconsistent processes. Communicating value begins with being able to name these benefits in language that matches stakeholder concerns. When you can describe governance value clearly, you can build support without relying on vague claims. Stakeholders are not all the same, and communication fails when it assumes everyone values governance for the same reason. Business leaders often care about whether technology investments produce measurable outcomes, whether priorities match strategy, and whether risks are managed so the business is not surprised. Operational leaders often care about reliability, consistency, and the ability to support services without constant emergencies. Compliance and risk stakeholders often care about evidence, accountability, and the ability to demonstrate that obligations are being met. Technology teams often care about clarity of decision-making, reduction of chaos caused by shifting priorities, and protection from being forced into unsafe shortcuts without appropriate authority. Finance stakeholders often care about disciplined spending, reduction of duplication, and visibility into whether investments deliver benefits. End users may not talk about governance at all, but they care about stable services, clear processes, and fewer disruptions. Governance communication must therefore translate the same governance system into different value stories that match these perspectives, without changing the underlying truth. Beginners sometimes think tailoring communication means manipulating people, but in governance it means speaking in terms that different groups recognize as relevant. When stakeholders see their own needs reflected in governance value, support becomes easier and more consistent. One of the most practical communication techniques is to connect governance choices to everyday pain points that stakeholders already experience. For example, if stakeholders complain that priorities change constantly, governance value can be communicated as a way to stabilize priorities through clear decision criteria and portfolio oversight. If stakeholders complain about repeated incidents after changes, governance value can be communicated as a way to reduce disruption through repeatable change governance and clearer accountability. If stakeholders complain about duplicate tools and inconsistent data, governance value can be communicated as coherence through enterprise architecture and information architecture discipline. If stakeholders complain about audits being painful, governance value can be communicated as embedded evidence generation and clearer control ownership. These connections matter because people trust governance when they see it solving problems they recognize. Communication that stays at a theoretical level, such as saying governance improves maturity, often fails because it does not connect to lived experience. Beginners should recognize that governance value is easiest to communicate when it is framed as reducing uncertainty and friction, because uncertainty and friction cost everyone time and credibility. When stakeholders understand that governance is a way to reduce recurring pain, they are more willing to support governance decisions. Another important principle is that governance value communication should be outcome-focused rather than rule-focused, because people resist rules when they do not see the purpose. If you communicate governance as a set of requirements, you may sound controlling, especially to teams that are under pressure. If you communicate governance as a system that produces outcomes like predictable delivery, controlled risk, and trustable reporting, you create a reason for the rules to exist. Outcome-focused communication also helps people accept trade-offs because they understand what the enterprise is protecting. For example, a decision to delay a release might be accepted more readily when stakeholders understand the risk to customer trust and compliance, rather than hearing only that a policy requires extra review. This does not mean you hide the policy. It means you explain what objective the policy supports. Beginners sometimes assume the rule should speak for itself, but in real organizations, rules are interpreted through culture and trust. Governance communication builds that trust by explaining the connection between the rule and the outcome it protects. When people understand the why, they are less likely to view governance as arbitrary. This is one of the most effective ways to create consistent support. Consistency in governance choices depends heavily on perceptions of fairness, so communication must reinforce fairness and transparency. Stakeholders will not support governance if they believe exceptions are granted based on power rather than on criteria. They will also not support governance if they believe decisions are made in secret or if they cannot understand the rationale. Governance communication should therefore include transparency about decision criteria, about how decisions are made, and about how exceptions and escalations work. Transparency does not require revealing every detail of every decision, but it does require making the decision process predictable and explainable. It also includes communicating how governance protects the enterprise from favoritism, such as by requiring documented exception justification and by applying thresholds consistently. Beginners may think fairness is a social topic, but in governance, fairness is an operational control because it influences whether people comply willingly. If people believe governance is fair, they use the process. If they believe it is biased, they look for workarounds and political routes. Communication supports fairness by making criteria visible and by explaining decisions in terms of those criteria. That consistent explanation builds credibility over time, which stabilizes stakeholder support. Another critical aspect is communicating governance value during conflict, because governance is most likely to be challenged when interests collide. When a business unit wants speed and a risk team wants stronger controls, governance provides the mechanism to decide trade-offs, but communication determines whether the losing side accepts the decision or undermines it. In these moments, communication must focus on acknowledging the stakeholder's need, explaining the trade-off, and tying the decision to enterprise objectives and risk tolerance. It should also clarify what happens next, such as what steps will be taken to meet the stakeholder's goals safely or what conditions would allow a faster path. Communication that dismisses concerns or hides behind policy language can escalate conflict and encourage bypass behavior. Communication that frames governance as protecting the enterprise and protecting stakeholders from future harm tends to be more persuasive, especially when it is backed by evidence. Beginners often think persuasion means strong rhetoric, but in governance persuasion often means calm clarity and consistent reasoning. The goal is not to win an argument. It is to maintain trust in the decision system. When stakeholders trust the system, they may disagree with a specific decision but still support governance choices consistently. Governance value is also easier to communicate when it is supported by simple, stable measures that show improvement, because evidence builds credibility. This does not mean burying stakeholders in metrics. It means choosing a small set of indicators that reflect the outcomes governance is meant to improve, such as fewer high-impact incidents, improved benefit realization, reduced duplication, faster decision cycle time for routine approvals, and improved audit readiness. When stakeholders see these measures trending in the right direction, they are more likely to support governance, because governance is producing visible benefit. When measures are missing, stakeholders rely on anecdotes, and anecdotes often highlight frustration more than success, especially under pressure. Measures also help communication remain consistent because leaders can refer to the same evidence rather than changing arguments depending on the audience. Beginners sometimes worry that measurement makes governance feel cold, but in practice, evidence helps reduce political conflict because decisions can be grounded in shared reality. The key is to use measures as conversation anchors, not as weapons. When measures support a narrative of improvement, stakeholders tend to accept governance as a value-producing system rather than as a burden. Communication must also address the common misconception that governance slows innovation, because this belief often drives resistance. Governance can slow decisions when it is poorly designed, but good governance can actually enable innovation by clarifying decision paths and by providing safe guardrails for experimentation. For example, when teams know the standard way to get approval for a low-risk pilot and the clear escalation path for higher-risk changes, they can move faster than when they must negotiate approvals from scratch. Governance also prevents the kind of chaotic innovation that creates long-term technical debt and fragmentation, which eventually slows innovation far more than any governance checkpoint ever would. Communicating this value requires explaining that governance is not an obstacle to speed, but a system for managing the trade-off between speed and risk. It also requires acknowledging that governance must be proportional, so routine work is not bogged down by heavy oversight. Beginners should recognize that people's fear of governance often comes from past experiences with bureaucracy, so communication must be backed by actual improvements in process usability. When governance is designed to be usable, communication can honestly describe it as an enabler, and stakeholders are more likely to believe it. Another important dimension is communicating governance value as protection for individuals and teams, because governance can reduce personal risk for decision-makers. When decision rights are clear and risk acceptance is documented, teams are less likely to be blamed unfairly for outcomes that were decided by leadership. When standards are clear and evidence is captured through normal processes, teams have proof that they followed the rules and escalated issues appropriately. This matters because fear of blame can drive unethical behavior, such as hiding risks or bypassing controls to avoid conflict. Communicating governance as protection encourages transparency and early escalation, which strengthens the governance system. For beginners, it helps to realize that governance is not only about controlling others. It is also about creating a safe operating model where people can do the right thing and have it recognized. When teams see governance as protective rather than punitive, they are more likely to support it consistently. This is especially important for IT and security teams that are often pressured to take shortcuts. A governance system that protects them with clear decision paths and documented approvals reduces stress and improves performance. Communicating this human value can be as important as communicating financial or compliance value. Governance value communication also needs a rhythm, because one-time communication fades and stakeholders revert to old narratives. A rhythm means regularly reinforcing governance purpose, sharing outcomes and improvements, and updating stakeholders on how governance is responding to new requirements and constraints. This can be done through predictable touchpoints tied to governance operating rhythm, such as after portfolio reviews, after major decisions, or after remediation efforts. The purpose is to keep governance in the shared awareness of the enterprise, not as a constant advertisement, but as a normal part of how decisions are explained. A rhythm also allows leaders to communicate lessons learned, such as why a certain exception was granted and what remediation will prevent recurrence. This supports transparency and builds trust that governance is not static but is improving. Beginners sometimes assume communication is a separate layer on top of governance. But communication is part of governance because it shapes adherence. When communication is rhythmic and consistent, governance choices feel predictable and legitimate, which increases compliance under pressure. Without rhythm, governance becomes a rumor-driven system where stakeholders fill in gaps with assumptions. To keep communication from becoming bureaucracy itself, it should be clear, concise, and connected to real decisions and outcomes rather than to abstract maturity claims. The best governance communication often explains a decision, the criteria used, the trade-off made, and what follow-through will occur, using plain language. It should also invite appropriate feedback, not to reopen every decision, but to improve usability and clarity over time. Communication should avoid blaming individuals and should focus on system improvements, because blame-driven communication creates fear and reduces transparency. It should also be consistent in language, using stable terms like decision rights, accountability, risk acceptance, and benefit realization, so the enterprise develops a shared governance vocabulary. Beginners might not realize how powerful shared language is, but shared language reduces confusion and reduces conflict because people can name what is missing. Communication also should highlight how governance reduces overall workload by preventing repeated debates and rework, because this is a value many stakeholders feel immediately. When communication is designed this way, it reinforces governance without overwhelming people. It supports the objective of consistent stakeholder support by making governance feel practical and fair. To close, communicating GEIT values so stakeholders support governance choices consistently means treating communication as a governance control that shapes trust, adherence, and decision consistency across the enterprise. Governance value should be defined in outcome terms, such as alignment to strategy, disciplined risk management, measurable benefit delivery, and predictable decision-making that reduces chaos and rework. Communication must be tailored to stakeholder perspectives while remaining truthful and consistent, connecting governance choices to everyday pain points and showing how governance prevents recurring failures. Transparency about criteria, exceptions, and escalation builds fairness and reduces political resistance, while evidence and simple measures strengthen credibility. Communication is most important during conflict and time pressure when governance is tested, and it must explain trade-offs calmly and consistently to maintain trust in the decision system. A steady communication rhythm keeps governance visible enough to be respected without turning it into noise, and it reinforces a shared language that makes governance usable. When stakeholders understand and trust governance value, they support governance choices even when those choices are inconvenient, which is exactly what allows governance to function as a stable enterprise capability.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.